For people involved in Missouri and St. Louis area politics, 2020 was a tumultuous but significant year. It included some key elections that will affect the state and region for years to come. So what better way to cap off the last 12 months than counting down the top 5 stories from St. Louis Public Radio's political team? That's coming up next on the latest episode of Politically Speaking, so let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
It's a little complicated in Bolivar because there is a Parsons family there.
But we also knew that it was important to make sure that we got to where we needed to go.
You know, if you walk in a room and you're getting ready to make a decision and everybody in the room looks like you need to stop.
And right now what happens in the United States Senate is as critical as anywhere else in the country.
I really want the state to succeed.
Well, we want everybody to know that we're all working together.
I just worked hard to try to build my name where I didn't have the money.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, St. Louis Public Radio political correspondent, Jason Rosenbaum. We have the entire St. Louis Public Radio political crew here for the last podcast of 2020. Joining me from all corners of these United States is St. Louis Public Radio's Metro East reporter,
Eric Schmid,
St. Louis Public Radio's State House reporter,
Jaclyn Driscoll,
St. Louis Public Radio's Rolla reporter,
Jonathan All,
and St. Louis Public Radio's Justice reporter,
Rachel Lippmann.
We are going to be counting down the top 5 political stories that affected Missouri and St. Louis area politics. As we have done in the past, we're using a very scientific method where the reporters and editors of St. Louis Public Radio sent me their top 5 stories. I assigned a number depending on how high they were on the list. So if you picked something number 1, it got 5 points. You picked something number 5, you got 1 point. And there were a number of stories we all picked, besides me, because all 5 of my stories made the list. That didn't make the list, that I don't want to just leave in the dustbin of what this year was. So we're going to do some honorable mentions, starting with Rachel. You picked the passage of Prop D, which is going to implement so-called approval voting in St. Louis. Why do you think that was significant?
I think that's big because it's going to open up a path for truly competitive races where you have to win by a majority. It's going to require candidates to get support from a broad swath of the city to win, rather than just being able to focus on their narrow little niches. And I think that's going to enable candidates with visions for the entire city of St. Louis to have a chance to win.
Eric, you picked the failure of the so-called fair tax in Illinois. There are no Illinois things on the top 5, and I would be remiss if we didn't talk about something that incorporated Illinois values. Jaclyn and I are very proud of that. Why do you think that was a big deal?
Well, I think it goes a little bit into one of the later stories of GOP romps, but I think this story is really important because we've already seen Pritzker talk about cutting spending, the nebulous possibility of raising taxes. This measure was supposed to, or it was Pritzker's namesake proposal to be able to balance Illinois' budget, and voters rejected it. So now in 2021, the state legislature, the governor is going to have to figure out a way to pay for everything in Illinois, and the state faces a huge budget deficit.
Jonathan, staying on the topic of things that happened in the land of Lincoln, you picked the rollout of legalized pot in Illinois. Why do you think that should have made the list?
I think it's the item that's going to have the longest lasting effect on the entire Midwest from 2020. You know, Illinois and Michigan are the only 2 Midwestern states that have legalized recreational marijuana. It had been a coastal thing for so long, and now it's in the Midwest. I think you're going to see a lot of states looking at Illinois and how it plays out here, and that's going to be their decision point as to whether it becomes legal in their state. And that could include Missouri as the years go on.
And Jaclyn, you picked a very odd General Assembly session that seemed to stretch on forever.
In a normal year, that would at least have cracked the top 5, just simply because the whole session was essentially blown up because of COVID. We didn't know if they were coming back. They came back. They did the budget. They did a lot of stuff in the last few days. But then the legislature came back twice for very extended special legislative sessions. And both times they had a very interesting ending where the first special legislative session, the House just dropped one of Governor Parsons' proposals that he wanted taken up, and that was for the Attorney General to be able to try murder cases in St. Louis. And then that second special legislative session, the governor just ended up dropping one of his topics that he wanted discussed. It was a really weird session, and I'm so glad that it was my first one because I think everything that could have gone wrong did. So I feel like I am totally prepared for years to come.
So let's get to the top 5. So at number 5, it was the passage of Amendment 3, which repealed the so-called Clean Missouri state legislative redistricting system. Certainly a favorite topic of mine. I think this was significant for a lot of reasons. First, this was one of the rare instances where a side of a ballot initiative fight that was drastically outspent, so this being the pro side, won. It's also notable for Missouri Democrats for a bad reason. They were really counting on the 2018 Clean Missouri system to close a lot of their very wide gaps in the legislature because it was pretty much agreed by everybody that it was going to create more opportunities for Democrats to pick up seats. But I also think it's like a victory for one of the groups that is kind of like an important group that isn't flashy, but I think gets the job done, and that's the Missouri Farm Bureau, because they were basically the only organizing force on the yes side. So I know that not everybody here is as enamored with redistricting as me, but who else was surprised by this? I thought this was a very surprising result.
I think it shows the power of the ballot language, what voters see when they go into the ballot booth. If you didn't know what the status quo was for redistricting or for ethics, or remembered that Clean Missouri was the status quo, if you just read the ballot language for Amendment 3, you thought this was the most amazing thing in the world. It's reducing lobbyist contributions and it's, making these changes. And the language made it seem like it was a good thing. And if you didn't know what the status quo was, didn't remember that Clean Missouri was what was in effect, it was, this seems good. And it also, just to me, the swing between when Amendment 1 passed in 2018, it passed 62% to 38%. And then it was repealed by 51% to 49%, or like 59,000 votes. That's a big swing of people deciding that they wanted to remove something that they had put in effect about 2 years before.
I think the more interesting thing about this is that I think that this underscores the level of trust that Republican voters in Missouri have for the people that they listen to. Because I don't think the average voter understands much about the Clean Missouri Amendment or what this did to reverse it. But especially in rural areas, the Republican representatives told them to vote for it, and the Farm Bureau told them to vote for it. And they trust those institutions and those people, and that's why they voted for it.
So the big impact of this is that no longer will a appointed demographer draw House and Senate districts based off this formula with competitiveness and partisan fairness. That formula still exists, but it's now very much deprioritized and changed and pretty irrelevant to the process. What's going to be interesting over 2021 is these bipartisan commissions are going to be appointed. I've said incessantly that I think that these commissions are almost very likely to deadlock. It'll be interesting to see if that actually comes to pass, and I'm proven wrong, but I'm not optimistic about that. And then the real power brokers in this will be the same appellate judges that wrote a fundamentally misleading ballot summary that didn't even mention that the same people writing the ballot summary hold most of the power over this process. But I don't really want to delve too much into this because I could talk about this for the next 50 minutes. So I want to move on to number 4, and that is Republicans romping throughout Missouri. It's not only that they won by sometimes historic margins. Governor Mike Parson, who was running in one of the only governor's races that was targeted by national Democrats, won by the largest margin by a Republican gubernatorial candidate since John Ashcroft in 1988. And Jaclyn and I talked with the governor right before he won on the Politically Speaking. And I asked him, are you worried that Trump isn't going to be as popular as he was in 2016 and that's going to cause you to lose? This is what he had to say.
I don't believe that. I believe the president will do very well here in the state of Missouri. Matter of fact, we're out polling him in most polls that you've seen, and he'll do better than what he's polling. I don't think there's no doubt that he's going to win Missouri on that. I think the big question is how much is the amount that he wins by.
So, Jaclyn, can you attribute Republicans winning everywhere just to Trump, or do you think it was also the fact that Missouri Republicans were better known, better organized, better funded, and just were better candidates than their Democratic counterparts?
See, that is difficult personally for me to answer because I am so new to the state. So all I know is Republicans dominating. But I will say, to your last point, I do not think that Republicans necessarily had the better candidates. We spoke to all of the Democrats as well, and they were fine candidates. They were great candidates. I just think Missouri has swung so far to the side of conservative voices it was kind of it was an uphill battle for a lot of the Democrats that were on a statewide ticket or in other election seats as well. So, yeah, as we spoke to Governor Mike Parson and obviously leading up to the election, we saw Auditor Nicole Galloway gaining in the polls, but Governor Mike Parson always felt very comfortable. And you could tell that when we were speaking to him, he said that, he was up, he's always been up, and he didn't see that going any other way. And I think that he knew Missouri voters quite well.
Jonathan, why do you think Republicans continue to do so well in rural Missouri? I know that Rolla is not as rural as other parts of the area that you cover, having traveled there over the summer. But driving throughout that area, you see Trump signs everywhere. You see Trump signs in places that used to be very Democratic 10 years ago. Why do you think Trump has been so popular in rural Missouri and by extension, Missouri Republicans?
Well, I'll go a little bit more general than just Trump. I will say that I think we'd all agree that over the last 20 years, the Democrats have gotten more left and the Republicans have gone more right. And the centrist candidates and the centrist Democrats that used to win in Missouri, they couldn't make it in that new political landscape. So I think that when the parties are going further away from the center, that puts rural Missourians more towards the Republican Party because they always were probably leaning a little right of center, but now that they see the left as very liberal and very progressive, they fall in with the Republican Party more. And I think that until we get to a point where there's more centrist thoughts in both of the major political parties, I don't think you're going to see a change in Missouri.
Eric, I've got a question for you. The thing that I started noticing is just how much the Republican Party is Trumpifying. You've got candidates like Paul Berry in St. Louis County filing election challenges, despite the the Sam Page got 60% of the vote. And I know that the Democrats remained in control in Illinois, but do you think that the Republican Party in Illinois may also sort of lean into this Trumpism, populism, damn the torpedoes, damn regulations, all of that in Illinois to try and continue to keep his base there? Or what do you think will sort of happen with that kind of left-right split that Jonathan was talking about in a blue state like Illinois?
I think in Illinois, it's really important to emphasize that it's upstate versus downstate in many of the instances. When you talk to people in the Metro East and across southern Illinois, they chafe at the idea of the Chicago politician, of Chicago politicians running the whole state, which in many cases does end up happening because Chicago is where most, if not all, of the people in Illinois live. The second largest metropolitan region in Illinois is the Metro East, and the Metro East has about 750,000 people, whereas Chicago has millions more than that. But to go more into the, whether candidates, fully embrace Trump, I think it's notable that Mike Boss, the representative who won re-election in Illinois' 12th district, he signed on to the lawsuit that the Texas Attorney General brought forward to the Supreme Court to overturn election results in 4 battleground states or 4 close states. Rodney Davis in the Illinois' 13th district, he didn't sign on to that, but I think Davis is notable because of his really large win against his rematch with Betsy Dirksen-Londrigan. That race in 2018 was really close. It was not close this time around. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot with the GOP doing really well in Missouri and also outside of urban centers in Illinois is that I feel like this election really busted up one of the myths of turnout, that turnout is only going to favor one party or the other. This election, we saw a whole lot of people vote, the most people vote ever in any election. And what that did in places that are more rural, have fewer people, is it brought out maybe 300 more people, 500 more people, 1,000 more people. You saw this in all of the counties that Davis won, and those numbers really add up.
Moving on to the number 3 story, is the passage of Medicaid expansion, which, again, if 2020 was a normal year, this would have probably been number 2 or number 1. This was a monumental policy achievement that's going to affect hundreds of thousands of people throughout the next few years. And it's also a big political victory for Missouri Democrats in a year where we've already established they did terrible. Jaclyn, what do you think the impact of the passage of Medicaid expansion will be from a political and policy standpoint?
I think it's going to be huge. I think that this is going to dominate the discussions for this general session as we head into 2021. Thank God that we are almost there. But yeah, I don't think there's any other way to say it other than this is going to be huge. It's going to be very important for the people of Missouri and, the people largely who voted it down in rural parts of Missouri. It said that Medicaid expansion is going to help those populations the most. So I think it's going to have an increasingly important effect for rural Missourians. I think this will be something that the legislature discusses and kind of tweaks, not just in 2021, but it's going to be continued discussion because obviously they'll have the task of paying for it up front. But as the program grows bigger, some believe that it's actually going to save the state money. So, there will be other avenues to put money in different places in the state budget. And I just think that it's really important. It's going to be something that we see discussed for years to come.
You mentioned the rural vote, and it's true that most rural counties voted down Medicaid expansion, but one thing that Genevieve Williams, who's now the vice chairwoman of the Missouri Democratic Party, she lives in the Jaclyn area, pointed out was the margins were a lot better than, say, the statewide Democrats, which means that there were more rural voters who may have voted for Parson and Trump that also voted for Medicaid expansion. Jonathan, again, not to typecast you as please tell me everything about rural Missouri, but what did you kind of see when this was coming out from people in Rolla, given that I have to imagine that like healthcare is a pretty major industry, and not only major industry, but like a lifeline for some of these smaller rural communities to even exist?
Statistically, small hospitals, and even much smaller than the ones in Rolla. I'm talking about like the 25-bed ones in places like Texas County or Salem, places like that. they have a much higher percentage of patients who are on Medicaid or Medicare, and they are suffering more because of Medicaid and Medicare issues. And we had 7 or 8 rural hospitals close in Missouri since 2010. And I think that what you were seeing is a lot of people who know that if without Medicaid expansion, they're risking their local hospital going under, because there are a handful of them that are on the precipice. And I think that this may be the thing that saves a handful of rural hospitals in the next 5 to 10 years.
Just wondering if this is going to be a message around which rural Democrats can say, try and point out the disconnect that sometimes exists in the state between policy and party. You've got, a party that is probably going to put all sorts of restrictions and limit it as much as possible as they can when they implement this. There's already separate standalone bills out there for work requirements for things like SNAP benefits. And I think Jonathan is probably going to counter my argument, but I'm just wondering if this becomes a way that the Democrats can come into rural areas and say, hey, this party is not in line with what you are supporting and what can help you.
Can I just, before Jonathan, I'm so sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but also I just want to say I've only been here a year, and that is a trend that I learned very quick, very often. Policy, oftentimes voters will approve more liberal policies, but they will always vote in more conservative candidates. I don't know why it is. I've asked people, I've asked conservatives, I've asked Democrats, I've asked them all. They don't know why it is either, but I don't know that is that weird. Okay, Jonathan, go.
I think the Democratic Party in Missouri is in trouble and messed up. And they'll have some new leadership this year, but there were plenty of people that, even in rural areas, there were some pretty decently funded candidates who ran strong policy-based campaigns and really worked very hard to try to reach voters, and they got very little support from the state party. And I know there are a lot of rural Democrats who are really not happy with the state party. So to answer your question, Rachel, I don't see that happening unless there is significant changes in the way Missouri Democrats view rural areas and how they approach it.
We'll be right back after this quick break with our 2020 year-end Politically Speaking extravaganza. And we're back on Politically Speaking with St. Louis Public Radio's Eric Schmid, Jonathan Ahl, Rachel Lippmann, and Jaclyn Driscoll, counting down the top stories of 2020 in Missouri politics. So we're going to leave the last two for the second half of the show because they're big ones. The number 2 story that we voted on, which may surprise some people who are probably thinking it would be number 1, is the response of political and governmental officials to COVID-19. Now, Jonathan and Jaclyn put this at number 1. I put this at number 2, and so did a number of people, which we'll explain later. But I'll start with Jonathan. Why did you think that this was the top story of the year?
Just because of the way that it manifested itself at every different level of government in so many different ways. Jaclyn did a great story on looking at the way that the 2 governors in Missouri and Illinois were approaching it and how different they were. You could go county by county. You could look at the city of St. Louis versus St. Louis County. It really granulated down to every different aspect. And I don't know that anywhere was overwhelmingly one way or the other. I mean, even in Phelps County, which is pretty conservative, it's pretty much a 50-50 split around here whether a mask mandate would be a good idea, for example. So I think that I put it up as number 1 because it touched every single political aspect of our lives in so many different ways, and it's something that just happened that we lived with every single day.
Jaclyn.
I don't want to echo all of Jonathan's points because he said it quite well. And this is not to take away at all from what we have decided collectively as a team is the number one spot. I just thought coronavirus was 100% the news story of the year. It's what we all talked about. I mean, it's affecting how we are all here right now doing this podcast, not in person, via Zoom. It's upended our lives completely. And the response, or as Rachel pointed out, lack thereof here in Missouri, that was the reason why people predicted that Nicole Galloway could actually have a shot against Governor Mike Parson in the election in November. It was just, it touched everything we did. It's still, affecting everything that we do now. So that's why I put it as number one.
That was stunning to me, was how, and this is just objectively bad. The response was, so much of what Parson did wasn't maybe necessarily directly coronavirus related, but even things like, the infrastructure to address the needs that were laid bare by the pandemic. Long wait times at the unemployment offices. Rebecca Rivas at Missouri Independent just had an article about the infrastructure around SNAP benefits and trying to get those approvals. His failure up to and until he signed the supplemental budget to spend all of the federal CARES Act money immediately and get those resources out there. Kansas City Star had an article, I can't even remember now because what is time, about how the local health departments weren't getting the money that the state had allocated, the way that he distributed the money so that areas that had more need ended up getting less money. Just overall, just objectively, the functioning of government. It was astounding to me that a lot of people looked at that and said, yeah, this response was good. Mask mandate aside, his personal responsibility aside, it just objectively, the response wasn't great.
When Rachel was talking about the infrastructure needs or, the long wait times for unemployment, now I have been critical in my coverage of Governor Mike Parson's response. However, in that particular area, I think coronavirus highlighted the infrastructure needs Missouri has as a state. And I don't know that the governor could be the sole blame for that, because our state agencies need assistance, they need help. And I think the coronavirus just highlighted that.
Now, I will just point out that there were leaders in and around St. Louis that did put in stricter COVID-19 restrictions, including St. Louis County Executive Sam Page, who got criticized from all ends of the political spectrum for different reasons. Here's him talking about that right now.
My responsibility is to look out for the health and welfare of St. Louis County residents and put that first and foremost. And that's exactly what we did. We listened to public health experts, medical doctors, our health systems, and we made decisions with their guidance, and they were hard decisions. And I think that's one of the difficult things about being a leader. You have to make the hard decisions and not always leave everyone happy.
I'm mentioning that because if you go to Illinois, and this is a good way to bring in our Illinois reporter, Eric Schmid, J.B. Pritzker put forth very stringent COVID-19 curbs. But I got a sense that they're not widely popular. I was in Orland Park, Illinois over the winter Christmas holiday. I think that there's supposed to be a ban on indoor dining, but I saw people eating indoors because apparently the Orland Park Police Department's not enforcing it. Like, there's been a real backlash to people and leaders that have put forth stronger restrictions. Like, Eric, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it is one part abdicating the responsibility of enforcement and one part people being really upset over the restrictions that are going in there. I think I know people who own a fitness center in the Metro East, and they were completely upset with what Governor Pritzker did at the beginning of the pandemic, because what Pritzker essentially did was he told people who owned a restaurant or owned fitness or owned retail or owned these businesses that rely on in-person interactions, he said, for the good of everybody else, you have to close, and you have to endure this just an immense amount of pain, financially, otherwise, and that really, really pissed off a lot of people. And when the restrictions kept on coming back, it was more animosity toward that. And then going back to abdicating responsibility, in many press conferences throughout the year, reporters would press Pritzker and say, how are you going to enforce this? How are you going to make people do what you want them to do? And most of the time, he would say, "Well, it's up to the localities. It's up to the counties, the counties, the cities, the places that are, the smaller jurisdictions to enforce this." And there's been some great reporting out of the BND. The Belleville News Democrat, that is, that shows how St. Clair County, being run mostly by Democrats at the top, opposed to all the other counties around, which are mostly run by Republicans, St. Clair County was the only real county in our region that was enforcing restrictions on indoor dining, threatening to take away liquor licenses, actually taking away liquor licenses. When the governor said localities have to take care of enforcement, it's kind of in a similar way. It's like Mike Parsons saying localities have to figure out how they're going to restrict too. So in that regard, when you push it down to the local level, the local politics is going to play out, and you're going to have people in elected spots who, well, they just don't want to make those tough calls because of the political implications or otherwise.
I do agree with Jonathan and Jaclyn that COVID-19 is clearly the biggest story of 2020, and we're never going to forget this year. We probably will want to, because it was a miserable year. I mean, I didn't like being in my house for almost 10 months and not getting to see people, and seeing how the economic fallout affected people that we care about, and how the healthcare fallout affected people everywhere. But if you ask me and a number of other people that were asked about what the number one story for Missouri politics was, it was Cori Bush beating Lacy Clay for the 1st congressional district seat. And I'm only going to speak for myself here. The reason I put it as number one, beyond just the fact that it was a monumental upset, it ended a 50-year political dynasty of the Clay family that was enormously significant for St. Louis. It broke a lot of barriers in the sense that Cori Bush is the first black woman to be elected to Congress from Missouri. But to me, there's two other things that are really important. First of all, this is the first person that was a protester in Ferguson that's going to Congress. And maybe I'm a little myopic because Rachel and I covered Ferguson, and it's an indelible part of our lives. But that's an amazing, and by amazing, I don't mean good, amazing as I never thought that would happen accomplishment. But number two, keep in mind that Bill Clay was elected to Congress in 1968. The decisions that happened in August could affect St. Louis politics for the next 30 to 40 to 50 years, especially if Cori Bush is able to stay in office.
I think it's significant because it shows, especially in the city, a potential path to victory for more liberal, progressive candidates. I was looking especially at the city numbers and at the wards that Cori Bush won as opposed to Lacy Clay won, and she was able to gain support from younger, progressive white voters. And it kind of shows and gives the ability of candidates in the future to use that model to kind of say, here is where I can get to victory. It was also interesting in the sense of, it's possible to lose touch with what your constituents want, even if you may support policies that improve them, help their lives, et cetera. This wasn't directly an AOC squad upsetting, truly conservative, longtime members of Congress. Lacy Clay is not conservative in the sense of he probably backs a lot of the same ideas that Cori Bush does, but some of the ways that he campaigned, some of the flyers that he put out in certain areas of the city and the county, some of the comments he'd made about protesters just shows that it's possible to lose touch with your constituents and not communicate what it is that you are doing for them. And like I said, it sort of sets up a potential voting block for how other candidates can win in the city of St. Louis.
I think for all the reasons that you mentioned, it toppling a 50-year political dynasty and ushering and really giving a up-and-coming progressive voice a lot more of a platform. I think moving forward, one of the things that I think is quite interesting is Cori Bush was tapped to be on the Judiciary Committee, and that's a big deal. I think the energy that she brought to her campaign, that she speaks through, that she brings from being an activist in Ferguson, moving towards politics, that's going to rock the halls of Washington. I don't think that they're ready to have someone come in and be unapologetic about who they are and where they come from as Cori Bush is. And I think that'll be really significant outside of the region too, to speak to more of to become somebody who can speak to more of the issues that both, yes, they affect St. Louis, but a lot of the issues that we see in our city and our region are emblematic of what's happening across the country. And having a voice in Washington to express that when there haven't really been those there before will be significant.
I think a sign of how important Cori Bush is that she actually came to Rolla twice during the campaign season, once before the primary and once before the general election. And she was the keynote speaker at rallies for progressive and liberals in the area. And, this is 100 miles away from her district. And there are a lot of progressive and liberals outside of the St. Louis area who see her as their congressional representative, much more so than the person who geographically represents them. So I think that her voice has a much bigger impact outside of her district already, and she hasn't even taken the oath of office. I'd love to hear from Jaclyn, because what is the reverb of Cori Bush to statewide politics?
No, I mean, this is not to have, downplay her win in any way, shape, or form. I don't know that it was felt, I guess, in the state. I'm thinking of when it happened and being in the state house and covering state politics. Obviously, it was enormous. I don't know how that carries over into state politics, because I think that the first district where she is already pretty progressive. So I'm not totally sure, but I also, again, don't want to take anything away from Cori Bush in this instance. But I also think that whole election cycle, when we saw young Black women becoming victorious, again, was just really, really important, really miraculous. And I think that lays groundwork here, but also hopefully Missouri can kind of use this as a stepping point, and we can see more diversity within state politics. Right now, overwhelmingly, we see older white males in the state house. I have to stretch myself to make sure that I am including other voices, because that is who is in power in the state house. And I'm hoping that this is just a stepping stone for more people of color, more people from different backgrounds, younger people heading into state politics in Missouri.
I'll be curious to see if she becomes a foil for the Republicans to say, just kind of paint her with the brush of, oh, do you want, don't elect the Democrats, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get a Cori Bush. And whether it becomes Cori Bush equals Democrat in the state of Missouri. I know she's traveled to Rolla, and obviously the 1st congressional district, incredibly progressive. That's where the progressive wing of the party for the Democrats comes from, where the majority of Democratic representation comes from in the St. Louis area. Just, and I guess we won't know until we see if she just kind of becomes, because she is so outspoken, the foil for the Republicans to say, this is what you get when you vote for the Democrats, and you don't want that because, radical crazy over here, not my views, just probably what they're going to say.
When we interviewed Governor Mike Parson before his election, he brought up Cori Bush in that interview already.
So I asked her about that, and she literally started jumping up and down like a boxer who was ready to fight and said this.
The reality is they are all using that because they're trying to be friends of Donald Trump, trying to, get in, trying to get that visibility. That's all it is, because I'm a Black Lives Matter activist. That's the whole point. If I wasn't, is there anybody else that they're doing this to? No, they're doing this to protesters, to activists. And so I'm good, because I need to remind them of this. You're talking about the woman that stood before tanks, that dealt with the real bullets and the rubber bullets, that dealt with the dogs and dealt with being, harassed and surveilled and all of that. You're talking about this one.
I think what I'm going to be looking for in 2021 from her is that the Democrats hold a very small majority in the House, which means that she and other people who are more progressive than the median congressional Democrat hold a lot of leverage over legislation. They could just be like, we're voting no on this giant bill that is dividing the parties, and they matter. But I also think that, she's talked about a lot of things that she wants to do. It's now time to actually deliver on the campaign promises and deliver on the aspirations, because I think she's in a great political position. She created what I consider more of an ideological coalition rather than one that is based off a person, even though I think people who meet Cori Bush really like her personally. Like, people voted for her largely because they like her ideas, and she's aligned with Bernie Sanders, and she supports Medicare for all, Green New Deal, stuff like that. Even though Lacey Clay is not going to run for anything, there are still people in St. Louis politics and Black St. Louis politics that were aligned with him that are still around. Whether or not they can mount primary challenges to her in 2022, I think will remain to be seen. I think anyone that goes up against her, though, is going to be up against an extremely formidable force that I think will be relevant in St. Louis politics for years, if not decades to come. On that note, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, not only our audience, but the entire St. Louis Public Radio politics team. It's always a joy to talk as a 5-piece as opposed to a 2 or 3-piece. For all of our stories, stlpublicradio.org. Follow me on Twitter at @Rosenbaum. Jaclyn, how can people follow you on Twitter?
At Driscoll, NPR.
Jonathan.
I am at Jonathan All.
Eric.
I'm at Eric D. Schmid, and there's no T at the end of that.
Rachel.
At R. Lippmann, 2 P's, 2 N's.
See you all in 2021, and let's never speak of this year again. Goodbye, everybody.
Was there something you wanted to say? Took out 2 glasses, then put them away. I was trying my best not to like you in my stupid way. I chewed up my pen, now there's ink in my mouth.